a seemingly harmless piece of chalk, small, white, and fragile, becoming the most feared silent weapon in the entire Atlantic War. A weapon so subtle that German commanders refused to write its existence in reports. A weapon so invisible that engineers tearing apart wrecked U-boats in panic found no explosives, no sabotage tools, no foreign fingerprints. Only unexplained hull failures that collapsed steel like crushed paper. And behind these mysterious implosions stood not a trained spy, not a hardened resistance fighter, but a teenage girl the Germans dismissed as insignificant. A simple factory assistant whose crazy little habit would lead to the catastrophic downfall of multiple U-boats, making them sink 3 times faster than statistical expectations. And here is the question that pulls you into this story with unstoppable curiosity. How did she, a young girl with no military training, no authority, no technical certification, uncover a flaw in the German naval engineering system that the best commanders, mathematicians and metallurgists in the Nazi war machine, completely overlooked? And why did German officers begin whispering about a phantom saboteur haunting their submarine yards, unaware that the real threat was a girl they believed too weak, too ordinary, too harmless to matter? This is where her story begins. With Elise Hartmann walking into the submarine assembly yard at dawn, her hands cold, her breath forming a thin mist in the freezing morning air of occupied France. The yard alive with metallic banging and shouting German orders echoing between steel hulls. Elise carrying only a worn cloth bag with minor inspection tools and a cheap, white chalk stick she used to track her spot check progress. Never imagining that this chalk, this ordinary, innocent school supply would eventually terrify German command so deeply that officers would patrol the shipyard, searching for the mysterious marks that seemed to predict which U-boats would be swallowed by the ocean. And as Elise stepped into the welding section where newly fitted steel plates cooled, she noticed something no one else did: the faint, almost imperceptible vibration patterns of the metal when tapped, patterns that are sensitive hearing, sharpened by years of growing up near old machinery in her father's workshop, instantly recognized as wrong, not fatally wrong in appearance, but structurally weak in a way only someone with her unusual attention to sound would notice. And because she had no authority to report structural defects under German occupation, doing so meant punishment. Suspicion, or worse, she simply marked them with a line of chalk so she could remember which plates she already inspected, completely unaware that her chalk marks consistently aligned with microfractures invisible to the naked eye. Microfractures that would expand under deep water pressure until they ripped entire submarine sections apart. Meanwhile, far away in London, British intelligence intercepted desperate German distress signals reporting sudden hull breaches, unexplained implosions, catastrophic structural failures, and yet all the submarines were recently serviced in the same French yard where Elise worked. Raising the alarming question within Allied intelligence, was there a saboteur in that yard? Someone targeting U-boats with incredible precision, someone marking doom with nothing but a simple stroke. And while Elise continued her quiet pattern of tapping, listening, and marking with chalk, she started to hear whispered rumors among German soldiers, rumors of U-boats collapsing mysteriously, rumors of commanders demanding investigations, rumors of spies hiding among factory workers, and for the first time, Elise felt a cold fear wrap around her because she realized her chalk lines were no longer harmless. They were being interpreted as acts of sabotage, and if the Germans made the connection, she would be dragged out, interrogated, perhaps executed. Yet something inside her urged her to continue marking weak plates, because every chalk line she made meant one less U-boat surviving long enough to terrorize Allied convoys, one less steel beast launching torpedoes at civilian ships, one less instrument of death roaming beneath the waves. One morning, Elise sensed she was being watched. Not by an ordinary guard, but by a German engineering officer whose calm stare followed her every movement. And as she tapped a plate and drew her chalk line, the officer's eyes narrowed not with anger, but with a strange recognition, as if he already understood the meaning behind her chalk, yet chose not to stop her. And here lies the chilling mystery at the heart of why didn't he report her? Why didn't he arrest her? Why did he follow her in silence, as though he shared her secret? And what truth did he know about those flawed plates that even Elise hadn't discovered yet? The answer to that question forms the doorway to the deeper, darker revelations that define everything that happens next. And as Elise continued walking between towering steel hulls, pretending that her heartbeat wasn't hammering against her ribs while the officer's boots clicked steadily behind her, she forced herself to work with the same rhythm as always, tapping each plate with her knuckles, listening for that faint tremor only she seemed capable of hearing, wondering if this would be the moment he spoke, the moment he accused her, the moment her life ended in a burst of shouted German commands. But instead, the officer remained eerily silent, observing her with a calculating expression that made her skin crawl, until finally he stepped closer, so close. She felt his breath on her ear and whispered something that froze her blood entirely. "You hear them, don't you?" A question she didn't understand at first. A question that seemed impossible for him to ask because no one should have known her secret. No one should have known that she worked not by sight but by sound. And before she could respond, he gently tapped the steel plate himself, listening with a grim, knowing frown as if confirming something he already feared. And then he leaned even closer and said, "These ships, they will die," his voice trembling with a mixture of dread and fascination, leaving Elise with the horrifying realization that this officer wasn't accusing her. He was afraid of the same flaw she had discovered. Yet he was bound by orders to pretend everything was normal because reporting critical flaws could be considered sabotage in the paranoid ranks of the German Navy. And suddenly, Elise understood why U-boats kept sinking after their inspections. The Germans themselves were suppressing reports of structural weaknesses to avoid punishment from higher command. And so the deadly flaw continued spreading, quietly dooming every submarine built in that section. But here is where the tension twists even tighter. Instead of turning her in, the officer stepped back and simply nodded, a silent signal of acknowledgement, before walking away as though nothing happened, leaving Elise with a paralyzing question: if he knew the danger, why did he let her continue marking the plates? Why did he allow her chalk lines to remain? And did he believe she was helping? Or did he secretly want the U-boats to fail as much as she did? From that day forward, Elise noticed a strange pattern every time she marked a defective plate. The officer would quietly shift work assignments so that her chalk-marked steel sections were used in submarines, destined for rapid deployment, as if accelerating the failure rather than preventing it. A chilling partnership of silence between two people who never spoke again, but who understood each other perfectly through the language of chalk and steel vibrations. And while Elise's fear grew, so did her sense of responsibility. Because she now realized her actions were not accidental, they were changing the course of the war, pushing German submarine losses into catastrophic territory. But German intelligence also began noticing something unnatural in the statistics. U-boats serviced from this specific yard were collapsing at 3 times the normal rate, triggering an internal investigation that sent Elise's heart crashing into panic every time an officer walked past her, every time a soldier inspected the work tables, every time chalk dust lingered on her fingertips like a death sentence. And she began asking herself the same terrifying questions. You might be wondering right now, how long until they connect the dots? How long until they start interrogating everyone? How long until someone mentions the quiet girl with the chalk? And what will she do when the moment comes? Meanwhile, British intelligence, noticing the same statistical anomaly, became convinced that an unknown saboteur was operating inside the yard with extraordinary precision, someone marking doomed points on hulls with uncanny accuracy. And analysts in London began calling this unknown figure the ghost of the slipway, an invisible force seemingly responsible for weakening the fearsome German U-boat fleet. But the most astonishing development was still ahead. The day Elise discovered that her chalk lines weren't merely identifying weak plates, they were influencing engineers' behavior, subtly guiding which plates were deployed where, inadvertently creating a pattern that caused multiple critical U-boats to share identical weak points, leading to simultaneous catastrophic failures during a major German naval operation. An event so disastrous that German high command urgently ordered secret inspections, restricted access to certain areas, and imposed brutal interrogations on workers across the facility, forcing Elise to hide her chalk habit more carefully than ever before, even as she grappled with the horrifying knowledge that her silent actions were killing hundreds of soldiers, sinking million-dollar submarines, altering entire campaigns. And yet she continued, because the alternative, allowing those submarines to slaughter Allied convoys filled with civilians, was far worse. But just when Elise thought she had mastered the art of staying invisible, a new threat emerged. A visiting SS officer with a reputation for uncovering microscopic patterns in sabotage cases. A man whose cold blue eyes scanned the yard like those of a predator searching for prey. Someone who immediately noticed the unusual frequency of chalk markings on certain steel plates and demanded to know who was responsible for them. His voice slicing through the air like a knife, and his workers froze in fear. Elise felt her knees threatening to collapse because she knew, absolutely knew, that this was the moment everything would unravel. The moment the silent war she was fighting with a piece of chalk would meet its greatest danger yet. And in this instant of unbearable tension, the question that drags you deeper into this story becomes impossible to ignore. When confronted by the merciless eyes of a Nazi interrogator, how did a powerless teenage girl protect her secret, her identity, and her life? And what extraordinary twist saved her at the very moment she expected to be dragged away? As the SS officer's boots scraped across the concrete, his shadow stretching long and thin across the steel. Holes like a blade ready to cut down the first person who faltered under his gaze. Elise felt a roaring pressure in her chest. Not just fear of being discovered, but fear of what would follow the interrogation room. The accusations of sabotage, the torture chambers rumored to be inside the administrative building, the possibility that her parents would be punished for her actions. And yet, despite this consuming terror, she forced herself to breathe, to remain still among the other workers who stared at the officer with wide, frozen eyes, hoping to blend into the crowd like a pebble hiding among thousands of others. But as the officer's boots halted in front of the stack of steel plates where her chalk marks were most visible, a sickening silence dropped over the yard, a silence so deep it drowned the sounds of welding torches and hammer strikes, a silence where every worker seemed to inhale the same breath and hold it, waiting, bracing, fearing, and then the officer asked in a low, lethal voice who marked these, while tapping one of Elise's chalk lines with a gloved finger, smearing the delicate white trail she'd left behind. And as his head slowly turned to scan the workers' faces, Elise felt certain that her legs would give out any moment, because he wasn't just looking, he was hunting, trying to read guilt in expressions, searching for the slightest twitch, and she knew that even the smallest hint of fear might reveal her entire secret. Yet just as the officer's gaze drifted dangerously close to her, the engineering officer, the same one who had watched her tapping steel days earlier, stepped forward unexpectedly, placing himself between Elise and the SS officer, saying with a calmness that sounded almost rehearsed, "Those chalk markings are mine," and the entire yard tensed because this admission carried enormous risk. And the SS officer, taken aback by the interruption, stared at him with narrowed eyes, as if suspecting a deeper scheme, demanding, "Explain," in a harsh tone that implied the engineer had exactly one chance to convince him or face consequences far worse than losing his job. Yet the engineer remained unnervingly composed as he stated that he used chalk to mark areas needing additional polishing or heat treatment, insisting that it was a standard practice, though it clearly wasn't. And for a moment, Elise could hardly believe what she was witnessing. This man, bound by fear and discipline like the rest, lying to protect her, shielding her from a fate she would never have survived. And as the SS officer questioned him further, pressing him on procedures, demanding technical details, pushing and circling like a wolf, the engineer delivered flawless answers, seamlessly woven with technical jargon and authoritative tone, making it impossible for even the SS officer to prove wrongdoing. And after several tense minutes, the officer finally stepped back, his lips curling in dissatisfaction, but lacking evidence to pursue the accusation further, issuing a stern warning before walking away, leaving the workers to quietly exhale their relief, and Elise, still trembling inside, realized that the engineer had not only saved her life, he had willingly put his own at risk, raising yet another chilling question. Why would a German officer risk everything for her? For a girl he barely spoke to, for chalk lines, he could have easily reported as sabotage. And the only answer that made sense, the one that tightened Alyssa's throat with emotion, was that he knew the truth about the flawed steel structure. Knew that the yard's welding process had been compromised by rushed schedules and poor material handling. Knew that Elise had discovered it. Knew she was marking weaknesses. And knew that exposing this truth to high command would result in severe punishments for the entire yard. Meaning, perhaps he believed she was doing something that needed to be done. Something he himself was too afraid to do openly. But this moment marked a turning point in Elisa's silent war, because from that day forward, she realized she was no longer invisible. No longer hidden in the shadows of the factory, no longer protected by anonymity, and that her chalk trick, once a simple habit, had become a weapon openly suspected by the most dangerous branch of the Nazi regime, forcing her to become smarter, quieter, faster, forcing her to erase some chalk marks while leaving others in carefully randomized places to avoid patterns, forcing her to change her tapping rhythm so that observers wouldn't detect her method, and forcing her to fight her rising guilt as the deaths caused by submarine implosions grew. Each new incident reported among the workers in hushed tones that made Elise feel both the crushing weight of responsibility and the cold determination that kept her going. Because every U-boat destroyed meant fewer torpedoes launched at defenseless convoys, fewer families drowned at sea, fewer nations strangled by the German naval blockade. Still, the story grows darker. Because weeks later, a new order arrived from Berlin. All workers would be subjected to periodic searches, including bags, pockets, clothing, and personal items, which posed a catastrophic problem for Elise her chalk. Her one essential tool would betray her instantly if found, and as she lay awake night after night in her cramped room above her parents' home, listening to the distant rumble of trains carrying soldiers toward the front, she wrestled with a terror that crawled through her veins like fire. What would she do when they searched her? How could she continue marking plates without being caught? How could she protect herself when the net was tightening around her neck? And was her mission, saving countless Allied lives, worth the cost that now loomed over her family and herself? A cost that could end with her disappearing into the brutal machinery of the Nazi police system. Yet even in this overwhelming fear, she found herself unable to stop. Because each morning when she walked into the yard and saw the looming hulks of U-boats being prepared to hunt civilian ships, she felt a burning certainty inside her. A certainty that whispered, if not you, then who? And this question became her driving force as she stepped deeper into danger than ever before. Yet, even as the German officers leaned closer to the chalkboard, squinting at the strange spirals, diagonal arrows, and looping patterns the girl had drawn, they could not understand what she already sensed with terrifying clarity. The U-boat fleet was becoming predictable. Not because the Germans were careless, but because they repeated subtle navigational habits they never even realized they had. Patterns that only someone observing from the outside with absolute obsession could detect. And this girl had done nothing for months except observe, measure, and compare those habits until she found one repeating flaw hiding inside the noise like a ghost. A flaw so small that even Allied intelligence officers had missed it, but she had not. And as she circled one particular chalk mark on the board again and again, her hands shaking with the adrenaline of a revelation she barely dared believe, she realized that if the Allies shifted their depth charge timing by only 11 seconds, the German submarines would rise too early, exposing themselves to sonar scans and making them sink 3 times faster than before, an idea so outrageous, so impossible that even the experienced officers around her hesitated, wondering if a teenage girl could really rewrite naval warfare with nothing but a piece of chalk, a wooden map table, and a brain wired differently from everyone in the room. And as whispers spread, she guessing, could this work? What if we're wrong? The girl suddenly felt every eye lock onto her, waiting for her to explain what she saw that none of them could. And the room thickened with silence because even she knew that if she spoke, She would be held responsible for whatever happened next, if she was right. Allied ships might finally turn the tide of the Atlantic War, but if she was wrong, hundreds of sailors could die following the patterns she drew. And still, she forced her voice to steady as she asked the single question she hoped would make them understand. Have any of you ever asked why the U-boats break formation only after their fourth dive? And at that moment, the officers froze, exchanging alarmed glances, because none of them had ever noticed that pattern before, not once. Not in thousands of hours of intercepted reports and sonar logs, and yet this girl had noticed it simply by refusing to look away from the chalkboard until every dot connected. Every number aligned, every inconsistency began to tell a story. And as she leaned forward and drew one final stroke across the board, one line that made every man in the room gasp, the truth finally became too big to ignore. Her crazy chalk trick wasn't a trick at all, but a mathematical trap, a predictive sequence of U-boat movement that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And now that the Allies could see the pattern, the question hit them all with the force of a depth charge. If one girl could uncover this, what else had everyone else failed to see? And as the war finally drew to a close, with the distant echoes of battles fading and the oceans slowly reclaiming their peace, the teenage girl whose chalk lines had secretly altered the course of naval warfare emerged from the shadows of secrecy and terror to witness the consequences of her silent genius. A genius that no one had believed possible, and that had changed the fate of thousands without the world ever knowing her name. And it is here at this final juncture that the hook seizes you once more. How could one ordinary girl, armed only with observation, intuition, and a stick of chalk, possess the power to make German U-boats sink 3 times faster than anticipated? And how did she survive the scrutiny of commanders' SS officers and the brutal machinery of the Nazi regime long enough to see her work save countless lives? And as historians pieced together intercepted signals, lost logs, and eyewitness accounts, it became chillingly clear that the chalk marks were more than guidance. They were instruments of fate. An invisible hand rewriting the rules of war while the enemy remained blind, oblivious to the subtle genius of a girl they never took seriously. And in the aftermath, as Allied fleets celebrated victories that had seemed impossible, those closest to her, including the few brave engineers who had understood her secret, realized that she had not only saved ships and soldiers, but had done something far more extraordinary. She had demonstrated that courage. Intellect and audacity could outweigh sheer force, proving that the underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked could bend history itself. And as she quietly returned to her life, her story hidden in classified files and whispered testimonies, the ultimate lesson crystallized for those who would hear it later, in a world where armies count men. Tanks and guns. Sometimes the most lethal weapon is not firepower, but insight, observation, and the courage to act when no one else believes it possible. And the question that lingers, haunting the legacy of this incredible tale, is this: if one girl with a simple chalk trick could alter the course of naval warfare, how many other invisible heroes, unrecognized, unseen, yet brilliant, shaped the outcomes of history in ways the world may never know? And as you reflect on this astonishing story, the suspense remains, the awe endures, and the truth resonates forever, that heroism often wears the most unexpected faces. And the girl whose quiet chalk lines sank U-boats faster than anyone imagined remains, in memory and legend, the ultimate testament to courage, ingenuity, and the extraordinary power of the underestimated.